So Karl Marx predicted this huge worldwide workers' revolution, but by the middle of the 20th century, it just hadn't happened. In a lot of places, capitalism actually seemed stronger than ever. So you have to ask, what went wrong with the theory? And that very question is what sparked Neo-Marxism, a pretty radical rethinking of power, culture, and control for a world that Marx, frankly, never could have imagined.
Right, so this is the central puzzle that kicked off this entire intellectual movement. All of Marx's predictions about a working-class revolution in these big, advanced capitalist countries, they just didn't come true. So the huge question on everyone's mind was why not? What happened? What changed? To really get what neo-Marxism is all about, we have to start by understanding the crisis it was born out of. You see, by the mid-20th century, the original Marxist blueprint just seemed broken. It wasn't doing a very good job of explaining the modern world anymore. And the challenges were immense. I mean, how could classical Marxism explain the rise of fascism? That wasn't just about class conflict. Then, in the West, instead of a revolution, you had this growing affluence. The very workers who were supposed to be overthrowing the system were now buying cars and TVs. This made a lot of thinkers start to question a core idea in Marxism, that everything, and I mean everything, could be boiled down to economics. They felt this economic reductionism was missing a massive piece of the puzzle. So this right here is the classical model they were all working with, or more accurately, reacting against. The idea is simple. Down at the bottom, you have the economic base, all the factories, the technology, the relationships between classes. The theory went that this base determines everything that sits on top of it, the superstructure. So things like law, media, religion, politics. In this view, the superstructure's only real job is to protect and justify the economic base. But the neo-Marxists looked at this and said, whoa, hold on. It has got to be way more complicated than that. Okay, so the first major rethink came from a group we now call the Humanist Marxists. Their big idea was to put people, human consciousness, culture, and consent, right back in the center of the story. The key figure to know here is the Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci. He argued that that old superstructure model was just too simple, so he split it in two. On one side, you have what he called political society. This is the state ruling by force. Think police, the military, prisons. But he said the really powerful side is what he called civil society. We're talking schools, the media, the church. These places don't rule by force. They rule by shaping our ideas and, crucially, manufacturing our consent. And this leads us to Gramsci's most famous concept, hegemony. This is power at its most subtle, its most brilliant. It's not about ruling with an iron fist. It's about making the values and ideas of the ruling class seem like they're just normal. Common sense. When the system's logic feels natural and inevitable, people actually start to consent to their own domination. For Gramsci, this meant that any real revolution had to be a cultural struggle first, a war of position to win hearts and minds, not just a frontal assault on the state. This quote from historian E.P. Thompson just perfectly captures the spirit of humanist Marxism. You see, class isn't some automatic thing that's just determined by your job. It's an identity that people build for themselves through shared experiences and struggles. In other words, people make their own history. But not everyone agreed with this. In fact, a rival school, Structural Marxism, argued the exact opposite. They believed it wasn't about individual people at all. For them, it was all about the invisible systems that shape our lives. Leading this charge was the French philosopher Louis Althusser. Now, his model looks a little bit like Gramsci's, but there's a really key twist. He also splits the state into two parts. First, you have the repressive state apparatuses, or RSAs, your classic police and military that work through violence. But second, and way more important for him, are the ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs. These are things like schools, the family, the media, that work through ideology. For Althusser, these aren't just places that spread ideas. They are powerful material structures that literally shape who we are. So how do these ideological state apparatuses actually work? Althusser's key concept here is interpellation. His famous example is a policeman shouting on the street, "Hey, you there." When you turn around, you've just recognized yourself as the person being hailed. In that single moment, you've accepted the state's authority. Althusser argued that ideology does this to us all the time, constantly hailing us as a citizen, a consumer, a student, and we turn around every single time, internalizing the roles the system has created for us. And here's a perfect visual for that. An ad or a university brochure, it doesn't use force. It hails you with a promise. Aim higher. become this kind of person. The moment you see it and think, yeah, that's me, or I want that, boom, you've been interpellated. You've become the subject that ideology wanted you to be all along. So this is the core debate right here, laid out plain and simple. For humanist Marxists like Thompson, people are the agents. People make history. But for structural Marxists like Althusser, people are just carriers for these larger impersonal structures. Structures make history. So who's really in the driver's seat? Now, there was a third major school of thought that also jumped into this puzzle, known as critical theory, or the Frankfurt School. They agreed that the answer wasn't just in economics. For them, the real key to control was modern culture itself. And their diagnosis was pretty chilling. They argued that things like authoritarian family structures were creating personalities that were just ripe for fascism. But their most famous critique was aimed squarely at consumer culture. Thinkers like Herbert Marcuse argued that capitalism keeps us in line by creating false needs. We're constantly being sold products we don't really need to find a happiness we're never going to achieve. At the same time, Theodor Adorno came up with the term the culture industry to describe how mass entertainment, movies, pop music, it's all standardized, like a factory product, to keep us distracted and politically passive. A later theorist, Jurgen Habermas, kind of reframed the entire problem. For him, the core issue wasn't just economics, it was communication. He saw society as being split into two different worlds. On one hand, there's the life world. This is our everyday world of conversation, family, community, where we connect with each other as actual people. And then there's the system, which is the world of government and big corporations, driven by the cold, hard logic of money and power. Habermas's great fear was that the system is constantly invading and colonizing our life world. Just think about it, how friendships are now measured in likes, or how we talk about education purely in terms of its job market value. That's the system's logic taking over human connection. So what is the legacy of all these really complex theories? Well, while they totally changed how we talk about power, they weren't perfect. They had their own blind spots, and they sparked new debates that are still going on to this day. Yeah, these theories face some tough questions. Was Habermas's idea of the system and life world just a little too neat and tidy? Critics like Garen Thurborn argued that, look, for all this talk about culture and communication, the fundamental issue of economic exploitation at work, that hasn't gone away. And then others, like Axel Honneth, they shifted the focus again, suggesting that maybe the deepest human struggle isn't for money or clear communication, but for simple dignity and mutual recognition, just to be seen and valued by other people. So, from Gramsci's battle for common sense to Althusser's ideological hailing to Habermas's fear of a colonized life world, these thinkers give us a whole new language to talk about power. They basically moved the battlefield from the factory floor right into our own minds. And they leave us with a really crucial question for today. When you're scrolling through your social media feed, are you making a free choice, or are you just answering a hail? Is that algorithm a tool for connection, or is it the system colonizing your life world? That's the debate they started, and it's one we're definitely still living in.